Good day there once again, viewers. This is your mate Kamikaze78 here, coming to you guys with some more Planetside 2 content. Today guys, I want to take some time to have a chat with you about weapon handling. More specifically, weapon recoil, and a little bit about cone of fire, more so about recoil though. As I'm sure you guys know, in my weapon reviews we always spend a good amount of time discussing how a weapon's recoil is a strong characteristic of its behaviour, and how you should compensate for that accordingly. But in Planetside 2, there are hundreds of weapons spread across all three factions in this game, and I only have so many hours in the day to make weapon reviews. So I wanted to create a resource here today that allows you guys to look at a weapon's recoil stats and have the knowledge to know how the weapon is going to kick and compensate for it accordingly. I have done one of these videos in the past, but admittingly it's a bit outdated, and my understanding of recoil in this game has grown considerably since then. So I wanted to give you guys a nice updated resource for you guys to better understand your guns. So without further ado, let's get into things here. Now, I know there's going to be a small subset of people in here who are brand new to first-person shooters. This is their first ever FPS, and they're not going to even know what recoil is. So I'll put this as simply as I can. Recoil is quite literally the kick that you'll see from your weapon as you fire it. Now, whether that be a kick straight upwards, or to the left or to the right, or shaking all over the shop, whatever, that is recoil. In Planetside 2, every weapon will have a recoil pattern that it abides by and dictates how you should compensate to ensure you keep your crosshair on target. Now, this said recoil pattern is built up from a bunch of different components, and understanding those will allow for you to truly understand how a weapon will behave, because it's not just one stat or another, it's a bunch of different elements. These quote-unquote elements, if you will, are vertical recoil, first shot multiplier, horizontal recoil, horizontal tolerance, and recoil angle. Now, the two of these that are the easiest to understand are the stats that relate to how your weapon will kick vertically, which, you guessed it, is the vertical recoil and the first shot multiplier. Vertical recoil is as simple as they come. It is a stat that determines how much your weapon will climb vertically every time you fire it. The higher the vertical recoil, the more aggressively you'll need to compensate by pulling down on your mouse to keep your crosshair locked on target. It's really that simple here. That is, until the first shot multiplier makes an appearance. This stat multiplies the vertical recoil of the first shot of your burst every time you pull the trigger. So every time you lift your finger off the trigger to realign your weapon, for example, and then fire another volley of rounds, you're going to have to deal with the first shot multiplier as you get cracking again. This is an important stat to consider, as it gives you an idea of how reliably a weapon can be tap-fired or quote-unquote bursted, if you will. When you're looking at these two stats here, it's all about deciding whether or not you should be holding a weapon down and doing long bursts with it, or whether you should be tap firing it. Will the vertical recoil over a long burst be more likely to throw your aim off, or is the first shot multiplier combined with the baseline vertical recoil going to create an even more excessive kick that is harder to control as you try to tap fire it? Now, only if things were that simple when it came to recoil, life would just be a lot simpler in this game, to be honest. I think overall accuracies would be a lot higher, headshot ratios would be through the roof, it'd be amazing. But that is just simply not the case here. I introduced you guys to the horizontal recoil elements of this game. This is something that I have struggled to understand for years, and a big thanks has to go out to people like Iridar, who have created some awesome guides for the community to help us understand the intricacies of horizontal recoil in this game. Horizontal recoil is controlled by, obviously, the horizontal recoil, the horizontal tolerance, and the recoil angle stats. And this is where recoil control becomes an absolute pain to dial down on at times, and why I'm actually doing this video, to be honest. Let's start off with the obvious stat, the horizontal recoil. This stat dictates the weapon's horizontal shift, if you will, either left or right per shot. So with this horizontal shift as well, guys, it's worth noting that as far as its direction is concerned, whether that be left or right, it's completely random, and on some weapons, the severity of the shift can be slightly randomized as well to create a more erratic pattern. So on some weapons, you'll have a very light horizontal shift that will see a weapon kick mainly up, And, you know, with a little bit of jiggle, that's normally pretty easy to control. But on other weapons, you'll see the weapon kick vertically, yes, but the main issue is going to be the actual shake horizontally. That's very difficult to compensate for. Now, thankfully, ladies and gentlemen, there is actually a stat here that helps to keep this horizontal recoil in check. And it's actually a big factor in determining how straight the recoil pattern of a weapon actually is, despite whatever the horizontal shift statistic is. You could have a horizontal shift statistic of 0.4, which is massive, and off the top of my head, I don't know a gun that actually has that much of a horizontal shift, but that would be atrocious to deal with. But as I said, there is a stat here that keeps this in check. That's the horizontal tolerance. This was the stat that took me forever to understand when it came to weapon handling, and it has changed my perspective entirely on how certain weapons handle. Horizontal tolerance is a value that will prevent a weapon from kicking horizontally in one direction for too long. In other words, if the horizontal recoil after X amount of shots exceeds half of the horizontal tolerance, it will force the weapon back in the opposite direction at least once, back into the threshold established by the tolerance. So, horizontal tolerance, guys, is calculated by taking the stat and dividing it by 2, which gives you the amount of horizontal recoil tolerance in either direction, both left and right. Horizontal tolerance is always centered from where the weapon starts firing, hence why we divide the stat by 2. Now, I understand that that's a very technical way of explaining it, so let's bring up a quick graph for the recoil pattern of the T9 COF as an example. The COF has a horizontal recoil of 0.21375 degrees, which I think goes to take the crown for the most amount of decimals in a horizontal recoil pattern in a gun here, but either way, I digress. It also comes with an accompanying horizontal recoil tolerance of 0.9 degrees, which means that we have 0.45 degrees of horizontal recoil wiggle room to play with on either side of the weapon's initial firing point. So for argument's sake, if the COF recoils horizontally to the left 3 times without interruption, the accumulated horizontal recoil is 0.64125 degrees, which is greater than the recoil tolerance. Therefore, the weapon will kick back towards the center point at least once. However, now that the weapon is back within the confines of the horizontal tolerance, there is a chance that the weapon will kick back to the left again, outside of the tolerance, and then be forced back into that wiggle room again. There's also a chance that the weapon will kick 5 times to the right and find itself exceeding the horizontal tolerance on the other end of the spectrum. Admittingly, that is unlikely considering the chances of it all, but it could happen. So, what does that tell us about the COF? Well, it's a pretty jittery weapon. The ability to kick 3 times in either direction does create a pretty insane horizontal recoil shift under long bursts, and is something that really does need to be considered. So, I hope that all made sense, ladies and gentlemen. That's definitely one of the more technical aspects of recoil, but let's go over the last contributor to how a weapon will behave, the recoil angle. This here is a stat that will, independently of all the other stats that we've just gone over, determine the angle that the X and Y axis for vertical climb and horizontal shift will operate on. Now, for some weapons, this will be a 0-degree angle, meaning that the horizontal shift and the vertical climb will act as it normally should. And just to clarify for those who are jumping onto their favorite weapons stat sheet now and seeing what it looks like, if a weapon has a horizontal recoil angle that is a positive number, it will be angled to the right. If it's a negative number, it will be angled to the left. In the case of the Track 5, there is a horizontal recoil angle that can range between 23 degrees and 25 degrees per shot to the right hand side. Now, to give you guys an idea of how the recoil angle actually changes things here is the theoretical recoil pattern of the Track 5 if it's fired on a 0-degree recoil angle. And now, here it is with its current stats in the game, with that 23 to 25 degree recoil angle. See how it changes things? We can see that overall the weapon features a more aggressive pull to the right, and if the weapon's horizontal shift pulls the weapon right, the weapon will push even more aggressively in that direction. Whereas if the horizontal shift pushes it left, it actually pushes the weapon in a more vertical direction. There are also some extremely strange recoil angle models out there that will stick in the low range of numbers, but will actually range between negative and positive values, creating some really random left and right influence, which look, these can be really painful to compensate for. Just recently here on the channel, we reviewed the NSX Tengu, and that is a weapon that features this kind of really strange recoil angle deviation, and it goes to show when you're trying to engage at longer distances. Now, at the start of the video, I did promise you guys that we would take a very brief look as well at cone of fire stats, and well, here we are. For those wondering, cone of fire is the literal cone that dictates where your rounds can land in relation to the center point of your crosshair. Basically, take the center point of your screen, and that is where your cone of fire is going to bloom from. Now, this is normally a stat that impacts hip firing in first-person shooters, but it's also a factor in aiming down sights in Planetside, and a couple of others that are non-arena shooters as well. Now, unfortunately, there really isn't a way to counter cone of fire other than simply bursting a weapon. But one thing you can do here is take note as to how the cone of fire values change when you're moving, you're sitting still, you're crouching, and you're standing. This will basically show you how you can best get the accuracy out of the weapons that you're using. There are some weapons in this game that will horrendously punish you for moving while firing, and some that don't give you the best benefit while you're sitting still and firing, and this gives you a good idea as to how you should look at using it in the long run. You'll also be able to take note and see that weapons that have a larger cone of fire bloom per shot may need to be bursted a little bit more often to maintain that accuracy. It's something worth considering here as well. Okay, cool. So we've gone over cone of fire briefly, and we've gone over recoil extensively. We now know all of the technicalities behind these and know what they're going to do and how they're going to impact your weapon. How do we apply that? Well, some people who have been here with the channel long enough will remember my old recoil guide video, and will also remember that we basically created 3 categories of recoil and explained how to counter each of them. We're not going to do that today. There are far too many different styles of recoil in this game that I simply wouldn't be able to cover them all here in one video, at least to a good extent. And quite frankly, there are so many different intricate recoil patterns here that honestly, we can't categorize recoil like we did last time. It was an oversight on my behalf. So this time around, we're going to do a quick case study on one weapon in the game, just looking at its individual factors and then coming to a final conclusion based on those factors as to how we should be using the weapon and how we should be compensating it more specifically. And for this case study in particular, we're going to use the Pulsar VS1, the default Vanu Sovereignty assault rifle. So let's start off with the main stats here. Vertical recoil is 0.22 degrees per shot, and in addition to that we have a first shot recoil multiplier of 2.75 times, which actually leaves us with a 0.605 degree vertical recoil on the first shot of every burst. So taking a look at all the elements of the vertical recoil, we get ourselves a fairly light vertical recoil per shot and a fairly light first shot multiplier total, which means that this weapon is fairly decent and fairly accurate under long bursts of fire, but it also has really nice tapped fire accuracy as well. Now moving on to the horizontal recoil, this is where things get a bit more interesting. Our horizontal minimum and maximum values are 0.2 across the board, which means that at the end of the day, it's a fairly light horizontal kick per shot. But in saying that, we do have a horizontal recoil tolerance of 0.7, which means that the weapon will kick lightly horizontally per shot, but it can kick up to 3 times in one direction before being brought back to center mass with at least one shot, which means that the weapon does have some prolonged but fairly aggressive shake after time. Again, the per shot horizontal shake isn't that bad, it's the accumulated horizontal shake you've got to worry about. Now on top of that, we've got a recoil angle here, a minimum of 17 degrees and a maximum of 20 degrees, which means the weapon is going to kick to the right hand side. Not as aggressively as the Track Vive, which we made an example of earlier, but it's still pretty bad. So this means that when you're using this weapon, you're going to have to pull down fairly lightly, albeit on the mouse, to compensate for the vertical recoil, but you're also going to have to pull a fairly decent way down on the left as well to ensure that you're compensating for a fairly strong right hand side push here. And when we take all of this and combine it with the accuracies from the perspective of cone of fire, you can see that in both crouching and standing, while you're still, you have a 0.1 cone of fire out of the gate, which is not that bad at all. It's quite accurate, and moving, it does bump that up by 0.05 when you're crouching, which isn't too bad, but it does bump it up by 0.15 when you're standing, which means that while standing and moving and aiming down sights, the weapon isn't the most accurate under the sun, so it's something to consider. The bloom per shot here though is quite agreeable at only 0.05, which means that the weapon is going to remain fairly accurate under long bursts. So in total, we have ourselves here a weapon that is very much capable of maintaining accuracy under long bursts, assuming that you're able to compensate for that recoil and you position yourself accordingly and don't get too aggressive with your movement. Overall, that's what we understand now of the Pulsar VS1, and it's something definitely worth incorporating into your time with this weapon. And guys, with that case study kind of wrapped up here, that's going to conclude today's video discussing weapon recoil and cone of fire mechanics in Planetside 2. I hope today's video addressed everything you guys needed to know. It was a bit of a longer one, I get that, but this is something that definitely needs to be explained, and in a fair amount of detail, I believe. It's one of the core aspects of gunplay in this game, and it's probably the one thing that will determine whether or not you can shoot well or not in this game. So, if you guys did enjoy the video, be sure to backhand that like button, it would be greatly appreciated, and if you find yourselves guys new to the channel, be sure to backhand that subscribe button whilst you're at it. As always guys, you can see my social media links in the description down below. I encourage you to go follow me on those as well to keep up to date with the things I'm doing here, and if you want to support the channel further, there is a join memberships button there as well, where you guys can continue to support me further there. Once again guys, I hope you enjoyed today's video, peace out, and I will see you guys all in the next one. Take care guys, have a good one.